Hey everyone, welcome back to Realpolitik. Today we're going to be talking about the latest developments in Ukraine for March the 10th, 2023. So let's get right into it. Alright, so not yesterday but the day before, Russia launched a barrage of missiles at Ukraine, and basically this was the end result. Basically, the Russians, they mostly targeted power stations in Ukraine. You can see in Kiev, they targeted multiple power stations, and even as far west as Lviv, they hit power stations there. And in the aftermath, Kiev, I believe 40% of Kiev was without power, and something like half of Kharkiv. So, yeah, you could see it's everywhere, even Odessa and everywhere. And this was in retaliation for the cross-border raid that took place about a week or so ago, I believe it was. It was a partisan group claiming to be pro-Russian, anti-Putin. And after these strikes, actually, Ukraine launched another raid into Russia near the border. You can see how it affected the internet connectivity, right? So right away, it just had a very detrimental effect on internet, power supplies, all the vital infrastructure. And the Russians actually used the Kinzhal missile. You can see it here on this Su-34? I don't know. But basically, the Kinzhal missile is a hypersonic missile. And this is the first time this year that the Russians have used it. And the thing is with the Kinzhal, because it's hypersonic, there's nothing, the West doesn't have any means, the West has no way of shooting it down. There's no air defense system the West possesses, the NATO possesses, that can shoot down hypersonic missiles. In fact, actually, NATO doesn't even have any hypersonic missiles in service right now. Russia and China do, and North Korea, Iran are also working on them, but the West is way behind. And actually, I think Russia's the only country in the world that claims to be able to shoot down hypersonic missiles, because what happens with the hypersonic missile is that it goes so fast that it above Mach 5, I believe it is, and what happens is it creates a force field in the front of it, and that prevents radar from being able to pick it up. So it's just going too fast for radar to be able to even see it. So the Russians have the S-500, and allegedly that can shoot down hypersonic missiles in space. So they're really advanced with their air defense systems. It's another picture of it. Now, this is actually, looking at this, is, I believe, the MiG-17 in Bakhmut. The Russians recently took over this area where this monument is, and I'll show you where it is in Bakhmut if you just give me a second here to zoom in. Okay, it's where is it? Right here. Give me a second here. Okay, I found it. It's actually on this Rybar map of Bakhmut, and you can see Bakhmut right here, and it's right here, MiG-17 aircraft memorial. And so the Russians have taken over this area, and now let's look at how that ended. Yeah, so this is the end result of it. There's a video right here. I'm not going to show the video. But now the Ukrainians are actually claiming that it was the Russians who destroyed it. But I don't know. I think it was probably the Ukrainians. It looks like an artillery strike. I mean, why would the Russians hit their own position? I don't know. Maybe the Ukrainians took it back and the Russians hit it. I'm not sure. But in any case, that's disputed. I just thought I would show you guys this. This is kind of funny. Ukraine war, Russian reservists fighting with shovels. I think I've showed you guys in previous videos this claim that the UK Defense Ministry has made. It's pretty ridiculous. Looking at some other headlines, there's a paywall here, but I thought this was pretty funny. A Russian victory in Bakhmut would be a costly strategic defeat for Putin. So, I mean, the Russians can't catch a break, right? I mean, Putin's obsession with winning the city is a vast waste of ammunition and lives. So even if they win, it would be a loss. So the Russians can't win, right? There's no way. And then there's Bakhmut's fall would not mean Russia is winning, according to the Pentagon. But then you have this. Zelensky contradicts all of them. Exclusive. Zelensky warns of open road through Ukraine's east if Russia captures Bakhmut as he resists calls to retreat. Now we're going to go on to the map, but right before I talk about them, go on to the map. Georgia's parliament. Now in Georgia, the country of Georgia, not the state, there's these massive protests. It's something similar to Maidan. Now they're occupying the main part of the capital, Tbilisi, or I think it's called Tbilisi, and they're not leaving. And this was over a law that the government tried to pass to ban NGOs. NGO stands for it's an abbreviation, non-government organization. They mainly deal with charity work, right? Basically it's charity groups. People from foreign countries go to a country and they try to help with poverty reduction and housing, orphans, things like that. The issue is that a lot of countries, Western countries, allegedly use NGOs as a front for foreign intelligence agencies to meddle in the internal affairs of countries. And in Georgia, they try to pass a law to ban any NGO that got more than 20% of its funding from foreign countries, right? So more than 20%, they would ban them. They passed that law, and then people started protesting. And then, interestingly enough, some members of the people linked to the U.S. government started talking about it, and they didn't seem too happy with it. And then you have these protests, and now they've revoked the law. They passed it, but then they took it back. But then now they're not leaving. It's something like Maidan. And then you keep hearing that it's a lot of young people, right? And you're hearing slogans that are really nationalist slogans, and they're saying they want to take back Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And that's basically in 2008. In 2008, what happened is that there was a war between Russia and Georgia. I think it lasted a few days, I believe. And so you see in the Caucasus, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea right here, right? Russia's right here, Iran, then there's Azerbaijan. Anyways, so Georgia's right here, right? South of Russia and the Caucasus. And there's basically two breakaway regions from Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And Russia supported them, and they broke away from Georgia. This was when Georgia wanted to join NATO. And what this did is this made it impossible for Georgia to join NATO, because any country with territorial disputes cannot join NATO. So now you're hearing slogans where Georgians are saying that, we want to take back Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And this will honestly end in disaster for Georgia, because, first of all, Georgia's a tiny country. They have a small population, a very tiny army. And look, obviously they're more well prepared this time around from 2008, and the Russians are occupied, but this war in Ukraine is not going to last forever. And if this war ends and the Georgians try to, during the war, if the Georgians try to provoke the Russians, the Russians at the end of it all, they're going to, no matter what, I mean, those who, there's a saying, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it, or those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And realistically, Georgia has been dominated by Russia countless times over the last couple hundred years, the USSR, Imperial Russia before that, and it would be silly for Georgia to try to mess with the Russians. That's just what I think, but some young people are really idealistic, and unfortunately they might get a reality check if they try to mess with Russia. That's just what I think. I mean, Georgia's so much smaller than Russia, right? Ukraine is too, but Ukraine is at least a medium-sized country, right? But, it's actually a pretty big country, actually. Like, it's one of the biggest countries in Europe, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it is. It is. Well, no, it's a medium-sized country. It's a decent-sized country. Right? But Georgia's like a little micro state, right? Like, I mean, you look at Georgia and the capital's right here. It's Tbilisi. I don't know how you pronounce it, man, but the capital is so close to where the Russians are. I mean, you're looking at basically, 45 kilometers, 28 miles. Yeah, they'd be in trouble, I think, messing with Russia. The Russians could just overwhelm them. Anyways, so aside from that, yeah, they've revoked the law. The protests keep going. Now, Nordstream. Oh yeah, this is the last thing I'll talk about before we move on to the map. So, Nordstream. Now, you know how there's a journalist, and the journalist's name is Seymour Hersh, and he's a pretty renowned journalist. He won a Pulitzer Prize. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He exposed the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, perpetrated by the U.S. troops during the Vietnam War. So he's been a journalist for like 40, 50 years, almost half a century, and he's really credible. And now the U.S. didn't like his report, claiming that the U.S. was behind it with an anonymous source, right? They try to discredit it, try to blow it out of the water. No pun intended. But now the Americans are saying that basically it was a group of anti-Putin or no, who did they say it was? Yeah, they said it was a group of Ukrainians that are against Russia, that are opposed to Russia's war in Ukraine, and they used this yacht. This is the yacht which they used, and they rented or bought commercially available diving equipment, and they blew up Nordstream. They're the ones that did it. It wasn't the U.S. It wasn't like intelligence agencies. It wasn't nothing. It was just a bunch of guys. They, rented a yacht, rented some diving equipment, and yeah, they were able to pull it off. Now, I don't buy it. I mean, this is probably the biggest case of industrial sabotage in the last half a century, I'm thinking, on such a large, on industry, like this is like between nations, right? Nation states, like this was huge, right? Nordstream provides massive amounts of Nordstream 2 provided massive amounts of natural gas from Russia to Europe, right? And to say that a bunch of people, and the worst part is they're saying that they're not identifying anyone, and they're saying the Ukrainian government had nothing to do with it. It was a bunch of Ukrainian patriots that are anti-Putin, anti-Russian patriots, and yeah, they just so the US they're trying to wash their hands clean of it. and the U.S. is not responsible. Ukraine's not responsible. Norway is not responsible. It was just some anonymous, some shadowy group that they don't even point directly to who they were. They're just saying it was a Ukrainian, a group of Ukrainian patriots who are against Russia's war in Ukraine. It's so vague, and I don't buy it. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. I'm yapping, but it's just so ridiculous. Anyways, now let's focus on the map. Let's actually focus on the map. So the map hasn't really changed much. The biggest differences during the last couple of days is that the Russians have consolidated control over all of the area east of the Bakhmutska River, and actually today there was a report that the Russians might have some of the Russian troops, Wagner troops, they might have actually crossed the Bakhmutska, and they might be fighting at the center of the city. And the Russians from the Wagner assault troops from the north are moving southwards in this direction. And like I showed you in not this one, like I showed you in this map, they've basically expanded and taken over this area, right? So they're somewhere around here. Now, the thing about this map is that this live UA map, pro-Ukrainian, the Russian, they were showing some an area here where you see this forest area. They were showing the Russians had a foothold here, and they were trying to move towards Chasiv Yar. But now they've removed that whole chunk of red, and but when you look at the map on the deep state map, it's also pro-Ukrainian, but you see the Russians close to the where the road is right here, where the MiG-17 memorial is or was. And then on the deep state map, you also still see that the Russians have a foothold right here to the west, right? Klashivka to the west, you see the river line right here that goes from north to south. So they still have a foothold in the forest, but this map is saying that they don't have that anymore. So that's interesting, but I think this is the only map out of all the maps that I look at that's saying that. I don't know why exactly, but you can see this map is still showing they have some kind of foothold as well, if I'm not mistaken. Actually this map shows it's a little west of the river line. They actually have a foothold. So I don't know, all the maps are a little different, but basically this map, Dubovo-Vasilivka, they finally updated it, and they're saying the Russians, because the Wagner actually released a picture where they have their flag over this building in Dubovo-Vasilivka. So the Russians have taken Dubovo-Vasilivka, and this helps them basically cover their flank to the west, right? So this helps them cover their flank and protect against counterattacks. And of course, in the big picture in Bakhmut, this is one of the last roads in and out of Bakhmut right here. And basically, the Russians are within rifle range of it, right? They're within rifle range, less than a kilometer. And this road right here, again, less than a kilometer, like half a kilometer or something. So within rifle range. So that's it for Bakhmut pretty much. And then in the north, if we go to the north, the Russians are steadily advancing towards, if you remember Kupiansk, how the Ukrainians evacuated Kupiansk recently. They made the civilians evacuate, a mandatory evacuation for civilians that had children, I believe. So the Russians are steadily advancing towards Kupiansk, right? And there's a lot of videos showing that in the forests of Kreminaya, the Russians are steadily making gains. I'm not sure exactly where they are at this point, but they're fighting in the forest. And some of this footage, though, is really explicit. So if you go on my Twitter, I'll post the video, the link in the description for my Twitter. You can go on my Twitter, and I post a lot of videos there that I don't want to put on Twitter because Twitter, their community guidelines are really strict and somewhat vague and contradictory sometimes. Like, they'll give you a strike for a video, and then you can find much more violent content that's not even close to being educational that other people post, and they have no problem with that. So I don't even take the chance when it comes to that. You can go on my Twitter. I'll put the link in the description. So there's fighting all along the front line. You can see the icons, the engagement icons everywhere, right? Bilohorivka and what's this? Spirne. Yeah, Spirne. I mean, I think Spirne's changed hands like a dozen times in the last couple months. But yeah, I don't know. The Bakhmut is really dangerous for the Ukrainians, I would say, because look at how close the Russians are to the roads. I mean, if the Russians were to break through in the north or in the south, I mean, if they were just to break through somehow, just take the casualties and just force their way through, muscle their way through, I mean, it would be really disastrous for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians would just have to, it would be like a mad dash, out of the city, and they would have to basically force their way out, try to break through, panic. It would be like a mass panic, right? And we started to see that a few days ago when they began to retreat, but then they changed course 180, right? So, Zelensky came out and said, no, we can't do that. And so now you have the situation where it seems they want to send more reinforcements, although I don't know how, because the roads are under fire control. So I don't really understand how. But anyways, if we move on to the south, there is Avdiivka. Okay, if I find it, so we have Avdiivka, and in Avdiivka, we look at the map, and you see the engagement icons, and the Russians, they're making their way north towards Severn, right? And recently the Russians from Opitne, they expanded their territory northwards. So and here I'll show you the map, Rybar's map. It's a little different. Just give me a second. So you see the Avdiivka map that Rybar's showing, and they've taken, the Russians have taken Vesele, and there's Krasnohorivka, another Krasnohorivka in Ukraine. They're fighting for this settlement right there. So if we were to draw that in, it would be something like this, right? Like, they've taken Vesele, and they're fighting for Krasnohorivka. And no, not this. So, and Kamyanka, right? Kamyanka. There's also fighting there, so a little bit to the south, yeah. So yeah, with what they're doing here, it's basically like a large cauldron, right? What the Russians are trying to do, because if we compare the maps, right? So Vodiane, the Russians took Vodiane recently. Opitne, Vodiane, They're fighting for Pervomaiske, and this map doesn't really show it, but it would be more something like, if it was more accurate, it would be something like this, right? And you can see all the engagement icons, right? So basically the Russians, the idea is that they want to create another encirclement, just like in Bakhmut. But this is going to be quite difficult. Recently, the Russians, I posted the video on my Twitter, and they lost some armor in the ongoing fighting. The Ukrainians used drones to drop munitions on Ukrainian positions, but basically the idea is that the roads to Avdiivka from the east, the Ukrainians can't really resupply Avdiivka from the east, because if you look, there's this road right here, right? And it goes through Krasnohorivka, and then it connects to this highway, the H20, and the Russians have control over this area, so they can't do that. So that's settled. So the only way that this city can be supplied right now, if we actually zoom in, we can see that there's a road here. See, there's a railway, right? But the Russians could always target the railway, put it out of commission. And some of these roads that go to the railway, I believe there's no road that goes from north to south parallel to the railway, but some of these roads just go to the railway. There might be a railway station there, but essentially you can see that from the north coming down southwards, right, there's a road right here that connects to Avdiivka, right? So the Russians, if they're able to take Severn, and the Ukrainians probably have entrenchments like trench networks everywhere, and the whole area is obviously minefields everywhere. But if they're able to take Severn and go northwards, if they can take this settlement right here, then they would essentially be able to cut off the last road that could or is supplying Avdiivka, right? Again, this road right here, they can't use it because the Russians control the highway, right? So, and the road doesn't really, there's really no other way, right? So basically, yeah, the whole idea is that in the long run, what the Russians want to do is they just want to take over Krasnohorivka and then keep moving north, and then they could eventually meet, and then pretty much if they take this settlement right here, they could also encircle the Ukrainians, right? And the Ukrainians would then be encircled, and they would have to just leave through the gap, right? I mean, that's normally you would expect them to, but with Zelensky, you never know. He might just send more reinforcements. I don't know, the way he thinks. So that's Avdiivka right there, and moving on further south. See, the whole idea to take Avdiivka and the whole idea of taking Volodar or Ugledar, as they call it. There's also fighting in Marinka, right? And in Marinka, the Russians have taken most of the city. The fighting is ongoing, though. The Russians have had mixed success trying to outflank the Ukrainians from the south. But basically, the whole idea is that the Ukrainians are constantly bombarding the city of Donetsk. They have been for years now. 7 years, even from 2014, since they've been bombing Donetsk. and the Russians want to push them further, as far away from Donetsk as possible. To do that, they would have to take Avdiivka, and ideally they would have to take Ugledar or Vuhledar. And if they could take Ugledar, basically they could outflank Marinka, and with the fall of Marinka and this whole area, right? Because you have to understand, the front lines are mined and there's trenches, but there aren't trenches going past the front lines. There aren't trenches and minefields forever, right? So if the Russians can pierce through the front lines, I mean, sure, the Ukrainians obviously have some defenses set up, but the idea is that if they could punch through the front lines and just force their way through unexpectedly, break the Ukrainians' defenses, then it's pretty much open season, right? They could, hopefully for them, what they're thinking is they could just roll through and basically take over this whole area right here and force the Ukrainians to move away from Donetsk. That's the whole idea, but it's easier said than done, right? I mean, I remember when you're talking about Avdiivka, just for Opitne, I remember they fought for Opitne, just this little area, for like a month, right? And fighting is ongoing, but I mean, they're like, if you think about it, the Russians are basically just something like basically 4 kilometers from their front lines to this road, and this is the last road that's really supplying Avdiivka, right? Although if the ground does become when the ground does solidify, because it's muddy right now, but when it does become solid, I mean, if the Ukrainians really want to, they could just send supplies through fields. If they're out of desperation, they could do that, right? But also another thing is, in Avdiivka recently, and again, this is posted on my Twitter, the Ukrainians are they're pounding the Russians are using their aviation, their air force, with Su-25s and attack helicopters to strike at Ukrainian positions. So that implies that basically the Russians have worn down Ukraine's air defenses sufficiently enough to be able to use their air force pretty freely. It appears in the videos. It appears that the Russians are basically hitting Ukrainian positions at will with their air force, right? So that could change the whole dynamic. But anyways, in Vuhledar or Ugledar, so in Bakhmut, it's encircled. In Avdiivka, we have a situation where the Russians have made some gains and they've sustained some losses. In Vuhledar, it was basically, when the Russians went on an offensive a few weeks ago, it was basically a failure. They've failed, right? And what happened is the Russians went on a frontal assault, and they got all the way right here. And there's a gas station here somewhere or something. There's I believe there's some forest, some gas station. There's a gas station, and instead of entrenching themselves right here, right, and outflanking Vuhledar, what the Russians did is they got too eager. They became they thought that, hey, you know what, we can take this city, right? They got tempted and they turned southwards towards the city, and they actually made it into some of the high rises, I believe. There's some footage showing that, but in the end, the Russians lost they called it the tank graveyard. They lost 50 armored vehicles and tanks in the onslaught, and the Ukrainians sent reinforcements. They pushed the Russians out, and then the whole thing fell apart. The whole offensive fell apart, right? And at one point, I believe the Russians even using this road right here, this western road, right? They actually made it somewhere like a couple kilometers north of Vuhledar, but again, the Ukrainians sent reinforcements from bordering towns and they pushed them back. So yeah, it was a failure for the Russians. Now, the thing about Vuhledar is it's pretty interesting because realistically, there are no roads in the north that can supply Vuhledar, right? If you look carefully, there are no roads going northwards that could supply Vuhledar. The only roads are basically right here. There's a road that can supply Vuhledar, and right here there's a road, right? From this road down here and then going up there again. And then so basically the Russians from the front lines, they're not that far away from those roads, right? I mean, that's like 1.5 kilometers, and this is like about less than 1 kilometer. So I mean, the Russians pretty much have all the roads going in and out of Vuhledar under fire control, right? So the situation for the Ukrainians definitely can't be easy in Vuhledar in terms of, receiving reinforcements and being resupplied. But they seem to have a very strong garrison because they've been able to repulse all of the Russians' attempts to storm the city, right? And one major issue for the Russians is that in Vuhledar there are these high-rise buildings, what they call commie blocks, and they give the Ukrainians a vantage point, right? And realistically, I mean, if it was the Americans, honestly, they would have destroyed these high-rises right off the bat. The Israelis, for example, they would have done it. I remember 2 years ago when the Israelis, tensions flared up, the Palestinians were launching rockets at Israel, at Tel Aviv, everywhere, all at Israel, as much as they were launching as many rockets as they could. And what happened is there was a building where I believe they were storing weapons, and the Israelis, they sent out text messages and they called the people, the civilians in the building. They told them, hey, leave this building, we're going to blow it up in 10 minutes. And then they blew up the buildings, right? They demolished the buildings, right? It was like it almost looked like 9/11. The buildings were completely blown to smithereens. So, I mean, but with the Russians, they don't do that. And it's surprising because I understand the Ukrainians are fellow Slavs, fellow Orthodox Christians, but I mean, that even under the Geneva Convention, when either belligerent, when a military conflict, either side uses a structure to gain a military advantage, uses anything to gain a military advantage, that becomes a legitimate military target, even under the Geneva Convention, international law. And these buildings become empty husks anyways, but the Russians didn't blow up those buildings. And I think that contributed to the Russians losing. That and the fact that they didn't entrench themselves at this gas station area to outflank Vuhledar, and they decided that they would rather just try to storm the city, right? They got tempted. But I don't really know. I don't know. Logically, what the Russians should probably do is they should probably just focus on, and you see this area right here, there's some I believe some housing units, some dachas. Dachas are like summer homes, I believe. And the Russians, they've been all the way up to the edge right here, right? But they've been pushed back, and I think what the Russians should do is focus on just pushing the front line and just holding on to this road right here, or just at least establishing fire control over the road, even with drones, whatever. And then this intersection right here. And if they could do that, I mean, the city's going to run out of supplies, right? Like I said, the situation can't be easy for the Ukrainians because look, like there are no roads that connect to Volodar, right? But anyways, the fighting is ongoing. The Russians are not giving up. And that's the situation right now, right? So, looking at the big picture, I think to myself, like, maybe the Russians shouldn't even go on multiple offensives at Avdiivka, Volodar, Marinka. Maybe they should just set up really strong defenses and focus all of their offensive strength in one area at a time. That's just a thought. But anyways, guys, that's it for today. The video went on for longer than I would have liked, but if you have watched till the end, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.